I'm Connor Ruebusch, and if you are interested in the finer points of face punching, you've come to the right place. This is Heavy Hands. Hello and welcome to another episode of Heavy Hands. I am your host, Connor Ruebusch. Joining me is the broken-backed Patrick Wyman, who is in a compromising position right now while we record this episode. But first things first, to all of our American listeners, a very happy Thanksgiving and a much belated Thanksgiving, or should I say a jour de l'action de grâce? Is that how they say it in French Canadian? I sure don't know, Pat. It's something like that.
I haven't the foggiest idea, but that sounded okay to me.
Yeah, and I just learned out recently that Canadians celebrate their Thanksgiving like a month before ours. So, what's going on there, Canadians? Why?
Well, I mean, too cold in November in Canada.
Yeah, maybe. Just too cold just to do anything. No one is in the mood to celebrate. They do their Christmas in June as well.
Yeah, that's my understanding of it.
So, thank you guys for joining us for this episode of Heavy Hands. Today we are basically doing a big ol' fight smorgasbord. We have a whole boatload of things to discuss and no clear theme for all of it, except that there are a lot of little lessons we learned from an event absolutely packed with combat sports. We'll be talking about some fights from Fight Night Mousasi versus Hall, some fights from Bader versus Nogueira 2, neither of the main events in those cases. You may have guessed that already. We will also be previewing Robert Whittaker versus Derek Brunson. That's next week's main event. And at the end of the show, we're going to talk about Sergey Kovalev versus Ward. I know some of you MMA fans don't care. If you have not seen that fight, you have to watch it. It was an excellent contest. Don't let the controversy surrounding the result spoil it for you. It was a very good fight that certainly lived up to most high expectations. So we will give that a little talk at the end of the show. But let us start things off with... I can't even remember what we agreed on, Pat. Let's start things off with Stevie Ray.
Stevie Ray beat Ross Pearson. Now he's the new Ross Pearson.
Yes. Stevie Ray fought Ross Pearson. This was from the Mousasi versus Hall card co-main event. Says a lot about the strength of these cards that's the co-main event, huh? But it was a pretty solid fight, I thought. It really didn't bore me. And Stevie Ray... You know what I think the worst thing about this fight is that Stevie Ray totally did to Ross Pearson what I know Ross Pearson could do to other fighters. Like, Ross Pearson is so much better than he has been recently. And not that he's a world beater of a fighter, but I mentioned this on the Bloody Elbow Vivisection, and Zane Simon kind of crystallized it perfectly on Twitter. It's that Ross Pearson doesn't know he's a counterpuncher. That's the thing that I got from that fight. He doesn't know that he should be fighting off of his back foot, because that is absolutely when he's at his best, when he boxes his opponents, when he keeps them on the end of his strikes, feeds them feints, occasionally steps into counter, and yet every single time he steps into the octagon these days, his opponent backs up and he goes right after them, and he doesn't do it that well.
It's not a coincidence that he has not performed as well since he left Alliance. Like, I don't know why that's the case, but like for his last few fights, he hasn't been working with them. And I think Eric Del Fierro really had him working on his counterpunching a lot and focused on that a lot and talked about the lot. And if you listen to Del Fierro in the corner with Pearson, he talked about counters a lot. And so I don't know why Pearson's gone away from that. I don't know why the camp changed. I don't have any inside information on that. All I know is that correlation is real. That Pearson has been a less effective fighter and a less effective counterpuncher, and those two things are intimately connected since he left there. So, but it's funny, like both Pearson and Ray, like they're not fighting to be top 5 fighters. They're fighting to be who's going to be a kind of a fringe of the top 20 gatekeeping action fighter.
Who's going to be the division's toughest out, but not the division's best fighter.
Yeah, basically a more striking-oriented version of Jim Miller is what they're fighting to be.
Yeah.
And not that Jim Miller is a bad striker, but Jim Miller also does other things, and neither Stevie Ray nor Ross Pearson really does other things. So Like, that's basically what they're fighting for. And it's kind of a fun niche to be in a division that has as many fighters and as many good fighters and as much up and downward motion as the lightweight division has. Like, that's a real legit lucrative spot that you can occupy for a long and productive career, as Ross Pearson kind of has for the last 5 or 6 years or so. So I just found it interesting in kind of a changing of the guard, passing of the torch type of way, because Ray is not all that dissimilar from what Pearson was before he got really, really sharp back in like 2012 or so. When he knocked out George Sotiropoulos is when Pearson really like sharpened up his game to the peak. And I think Ray is like a more physically gifted version of that just before Pearson made that leap.
Yeah, I agree. And it's kind of the second major passing of the torch. Actually, we didn't plan on talking about this fight at all, but a couple weeks ago, Raquel Pennington beat Miesha Tate, and our buddy Schwan Humes, who of course is the biggest Miesha Tate fan in the world, wasn't too sad about it because, as he put it, Rocky Pennington is the new Miesha Tate. She kind of did Miesha Tate things with a slightly different style to beat Miesha Tate. She's got the grit, she's got the determination and the adaptability. She's well-rounded enough to compete with anyone, anywhere. I know it doesn't have the same sexiness as like a passing of the torch of a dominant champion or whatever, but I find these little changing of roles in the middle of the division to be really fascinating, because these are the guys that really interest me. Guys like Stevie Ray and Ross Pearson, guys like gals like Rocky Pennington and Miesha Tate, who really hold their own and maybe lack for the same athletic advantages or even some of the skill advantages, ones in which they'll never catch up to their opponents who've been grappling, for example, since their youth. They may lack those advantages, but they come in and they're crafty and they don't let anyone beat them easily. Now, of course, I think Stevie Ray did let Alan Patrick beat him pretty easily. And Alan Patrick is not a guy who tends to beat people easily often, but there is time still for Stevie Ray to turn into a guy who can build the rest of his game up around the kind of performance he put on Saturday.
But that's exactly the charm of a guy like Stevie Ray or Ross Pearson, is that they're always going to find ways to lose fights that they shouldn't, and that's why they're not top fighters.
Sure.
Like, it's not like you don't love these guys because they're unbeatable or because they're on like some run to the top. And like, that's not an insult to either of these guys. I think they're both really, really good fighters. It's just that like there's always going to be a thing that stops them. And in Stevie Ray's case, it's like he can be a really good defensive wrestler. Ross Pearson is a really good defensive wrestler, and sometimes they're still going to give up stupid takedowns, which is what happened with Ray. And they're still going to take fights that they probably shouldn't take. Like, there was no good reason, except for, I assume, probably personal financial need, because I know he's got a bunch of kids, for Ray to take a short notice fight against Alan Patrick. There's no good reason to do that.
Yeah. It's kind of a horrible matchup on super short notice. Yeah. It's I guess the appeal of these fighters, the best way I can think to phrase it is that they are strong underdogs and weak favorites all the time. They're never so reliable that you can count on them rocketing to the top, but they are never out of it enough that you can confidently pick someone over them, and you will often be surprised when they turn it around and get a win, as was the case here. I wasn't certain that Ray would beat Pearson, but he fought a smart fight and beat him very clearly, and I thought it would be a bit dicier than it was.
Yeah, I'll be honest. This fight went exactly the way I thought it would. Mostly because I think it's kind of unfortunate, but I do think Pearson is a little bit past his peak.
Yeah.
And like the camp stuff is just kind of a symptom of the underlying thing. Because he's been fighting as a professional, I think, for 11 years. Pearson has, maybe 12 years actually.
It seems crazy to me. I did not realize. I mean, the fight with Edson Barboza seems like it was yesterday to me. I remember watching that fight so clearly. That was in 2011. 5 years ago. More than 5 years ago, almost. Let's see.
It was August of 2011. It was
More
UFC
than
134.
Years ago, 5.5 years ago, almost. Crazy. I did not realize he'd been in the UFC that long. But you look at his record. I saw it just the other day, scrolling down. It's like, yeah, he's been win-loss. Holy shit, for a long time now. It felt like he was on kind of a streak not that long ago. And it really was a long time ago. So it's not surprising that he's maybe nearing the end of his run. He's 32 years old, but he's been in a lot of fights, taken more punishment lately, but never been a guy who, being a striker who likes to fight in the pocket, has always been there to be hit. So it wouldn't be surprising if he's starting to feel the effects of that kind of style now. So now that we've covered that, Pat, let's move on to bigger and better things. Let's talk about the man, the legend, the guy that I said that about I said that about Mark Henry last week too. It's the only way I can think to describe anything. But we wanted to do a little crowing here, Pat. You in particular, but I am going to join you.
Yeah,
we've both been on. Yes.
Because we have both been on the Krzysztof Jotko train for a long time now. Long time. We've been on the Krzysztof Jotko train since it was just you, me, a Polish forum poster, and Jotko's mother. Like we were the original 4 passengers on this train. And now, guess what, motherfuckers? He's a top 10 middleweight. Legit. Top 10 middleweight.
Yeah, no denying it.
It's funny. It's been funny to watch this because like he's not a guy who's particularly flashy. He's a meat and potatoes fighter who has pretty good fundamentals, who knows exactly what he wants to do in the cage, and who fights to a game plan. He is a smart fighter with good, well-rounded tools, who has made consistent improvements. And that doesn't sound like it's that impressive, I guess, on paper. But like watching it play out in practice, he's 19-1, and his only loss is to Magnus Siedenblad, who is actually a very good fighter.
Yeah.
So. Like, I just kind of love what he's done because every fight he comes out and he's better than he was the fight before.
Yeah, absolutely. He's consistently getting better. He's clearly able to adapt. You know, he had some tough early moments in a couple of his last few fights. I guess maybe even many of them. I guess maybe the Scott Askham fight didn't start out great. The Brad Scott fight was a little hard going at first. And the latest one, Teleslitis, kind of took the first round off of him. He has not exactly won those rounds while also not taking a ton of damage because he is a safe and smart fighter, and then also proven that he can adapt and take his opponent's strengths away, which is something I think you really need if you're not like a complete physical freak or something like that. You do say, however, he's not a flashy fighter. How about that up elbow that he throws constantly, Pat?
Well, I mean, but he throws it in such a way that it's not exciting. I mean, I'll be honest, because he throws it so often. This is not like Anderson Silva throwing it out of nowhere against against Tony Strickland. This is like, it's Krzysztof Jotko throwing the up elbow. We know that this is going to happen.
It's his patented up elbow. Yeah, it's. I do kind of like the way he uses it. I kind of want to talk about it a little bit.
I'm a big fan of the way he uses it. It's just he manages to do it in such a way that it's as meat and potatoes as his left body kick.
Yeah, it is very strange. It lands a lot less often than his left body kick too. But it's kind of interesting. He kind of fights out of a bit of like a crab guard, like a shell type of position. And that elbow, he will use it to lead almost as a double defense and offense, where he can hope to catch his opponent. If they duck when they see him coming forward, he will clip them with the elbow. But if they throw, he's got that high elbow, the same way Rory McDonald uses it, or the way Andre Ward uses his elbow. A lot of fighters do, sort of flare their elbow and show the back of their arm and their armpit to the opponent to glance off a shot from the outside. And so it's basically a shield as he closes distance, because he usually follows it with his straight left. It's a shield as well as something that somebody could run into. And I also think it's just kind of a silly distraction, because it's such a ridiculous strike to lead with as often as Jotko does, that people their eyes get fixated on avoiding this elbow. They think they've gotten the obvious thing out of the way, and then the actual technical strikes, the straight left, the left kick, and the takedown come behind it. So it's a very weird part of his game, but I think it just kind of adds to the charm of what is otherwise a totally straightforward technical approach to MMA.
Yeah, it's the one thing that kind of sets him apart from a lot of other fighters, like in terms of the actual strike selection that he uses.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, like, he's 1-2-1, like he's 2-3 body kick, 1-2-3 body kick, left low kick, like punch into the clinch, change levels for a takedown. Like it's not a particularly exciting kind of game, but I really like the way that he puts it all together because it's smart. It's really smart.
Well, I mean, you and I, we appreciate intelligent fighting. That's just the way it is. And I don't mean that to sound elitist, but like people know what our tastes are when it comes to fighters. That somebody like John Dotson, who most people consider to be very exciting, kind of frustrates you and I. And someone like Krzysztof Jotko, who is mostly a decision machine, is really interesting to us. But I just like the idea of a fighter who can come in and not be compare him to Talis. I looked at the numbers. He's the same height. He comes in at the same weight. He looked so much smaller and weaker than Talis in the early going in that fight. He's not a gigantic middleweight like some of these guys are. He put it this way, Krzysztof Jotko would be absolutely dwarfed if he were to move to light heavyweight. He looks more like a welterweight than a light heavyweight. But he comes in and he fights intelligently to overcome that. And those are the kind of fighters that always kind of get to me. So I want to ask you, Pat, we have now a crop of, for a while there, it looked like middleweight was going to be good for a very short time again and then be gone, because we have a lot of fighters that came over from Strikeforce that rejuvenated the division in a way, but now they are all old. Chris Weidman is not that young. How old is Luke Rockhold? He's still pretty young, right?
He's 32.
Okay, so not that young. I mean, he still has a few more years in him. But then Jacare and Romero are both getting on in years. Romero especially. Michael Bisping is the champ, and he is, I think, the oldest of the bunch, aside from maybe Romero, who is 3,000 years old. But now we actually do have a crop of new young contenders moving up through this division. Guys like Robert Whittaker, guys like Derek Brunson. Those two guys are fighting this next weekend. But also, Talis Litis. And there are some other ones too. Jack Hermanson.
Well, Litis is not young, but Jotko.
I meant Jotko. Sorry, yeah.
Jotko, Brunson, Whittaker, all of those guys are fairly young.
I was
Even
looking
Mousasi is not that old. Mousasi's 31.
And Mousasi's really coming into his own. I didn't mean to say Jotko, by the way. I was looking at his record and read the last name off of it. Krzysztof Jotko. And Cesar Ferreira may be turning things around, but by beating Jack Hermanson. But I still think Jack Hermanson has a lot of potential to be a contender. So how far could you see someone like Krzysztof Jotko going? We've said basically that he's a meat and potatoes fighter, not a superb athlete, but I think there's a different ceiling for those kinds of guys at middleweight.
Oh, as opposed to something at welterweight, guys like that top out around the top 15. We've seen plenty of guys like Tarek Saffiedine is a good example. Like, we know what Tarek Saffiedine's ceiling is at this point, because Saffiedine is not a dissimilar kind of fighter. I think Jotko is maybe a little more gifted than him, but like those guys, it's basically between 12 and 15 in that division is where they're going to shake out. There's just too much talent. At lightweight, guys like that don't barely even crack the top 20. But at middleweight, where you don't have a ton of kind of young up and coming talent, where there isn't as much competition for those slots, like I think he's like he could be a fringe top 5 fighter. Like, I don't think he's ever going to be like the hyper athletic, relatively youthful guys at the top of the division. But I think he can like slot in between 5 and 10 for a long time. Like, at this point, as sad as it is to say, I would probably pick him over Anderson Silva. I would definitely pick him over Vitor Belfort. I think he would be competitive with somebody like Gegard Mousasi, even if he would lose that fight.
Sure.
I don't know that he would beat any of those guys, but I don't know that he would lose to anybody lower than that.
It's hard to see him getting wiped out by a lot of those guys.
Yeah.
By a lot of, even the guys at the top of the division now. And if he continues to improve at this rate, he's only 27. He definitely has time to keep building complexity into his game, which can only help a fighter of his type. He's like a less aggressive Michael Bisping type for this division. He's similar in a lot of ways, that in having stamina and movement being his best friends, but more of a pot shotter, more reliant on movement. Michael Bisping has always liked tearing people's heads off, even if for most of his UFC career people said that he couldn't possibly do it. So that often got him into trouble. I don't think Jotko, I think he's a little more tempered than that. But, we've seen how well somebody like that can do in this division. And I don't really see that changing too dramatically going forward. So
yeah, I'm with that. So we had a couple more that we wanted to talk about, right?
Yeah, why don't we take a break first, actually, before we get to them. We wanted to talk about Tomas Almeida and Kamaru Usman, both of whom also competed last week. And then we're going to talk about next week's main event, Derek Brunson versus Robert Whittaker. A lot of middleweight action on this week's episode, Pat. I'm pleased about that. I cannot complain. So
that is very much your jam, sir.
We will talk some more about some middleweights after this break. Hey everybody, thanks for listening to this week's Heavy Hands. If you like what you hear, please consider pledging to support the podcast on Patreon. Patreon is basically continuous crowdfunding. You sign up to contribute a certain amount per month to help us with production costs and the like, and in return you get rewards ranging from a mention on the Heavy Hands website to a question or topic of your choice being discussed on the show. We have a lot more in the works to reward you for your help, and we appreciate every contribution. No amount is too small. Just head over to patreon.com and find how you can help out, the only show dedicated to the finer points of face punching. Now let's get back to it. And welcome back to Heavy Hands. Tomas Almeida competed last weekend, Pat and listeners. He fought Albert Morales in a fight that seemed to make no sense from a matchmaking perspective, but which I guess delivered in a way from an action perspective. What did you think of his performance, Pat?
I thought it was a quintessential Tomas Almeida performance in that he got touched up a little bit early, and then once he turned up the volume, he looked fantastic. I thought Morales was a lot like a guy that Almeida wiped out last year, and Anthony Birchak, a big, strong, athletic, powerful puncher who doesn't quite have that kind of craft. You know, and I thought that Almeida's craft would be the difference, and lo and behold, it was. If you were looking for reasons to maybe reevaluate Almeida after his loss to Cody Garbrandt, I don't think he showed you a lot here that made you think like, oh, this is a guy for whom that is never going to be a problem again. I think this is always going to be an issue for Almeida. Can you touch him early? But if he can get past that, because it's been a thing in all of his fights going back like to when he was on the regional scene. But if he can get past that little window, God, he's devastating. I don't know if there's a more devastating fighter after about the 4-minute mark in that entire division. Yeah,
absolutely. And within a weekend that featured some really good boxing action, it was the kind of gif that I just wanted to show to all of my boxing friends, the finishing sequence in that fight, which, by the way, I did not watch it live with commentary because I was also watching boxing at the time. I hear the commentators were essentially screaming at the ref to stop the fight during that finishing sequence.
Yeah, which is kind of an encapsulation of Tomas Almeida's entire career, is just commentators screaming "Stop the fight" while Almeida flurries against the fence.
He's pretty scary. Yeah, it's that vulnerability paired with the scariness. It does worry me, you know, seeing Morales kind of tag him a little bit, not be completely unsuccessful, and that's kind of what I expected going in, and I was kind of hoping my expectations would be wrong. I was kind of hoping that I would see Tomas Almeida go in there and show a seriously new wrinkle. And I don't really know what I was looking for because I know this is his style and I know it makes him vulnerable. But, you know, I just worry that with performances as exciting as his, he is always going to be thrust right back into the top of the division. And I don't know that he will ever get enough time against like a somewhat easier level of opposition to fine-tune the defense enough that he will be, you know, relatively invulnerable to that early struggle.
Yeah, well, I mean, but it's not really the defense per se. It's getting timing and distance, because like he has the defensive skills, like because if you look after the first like 2, 3, 4 minutes of a fight, Almeida is really hard to hit and very hard to hit cleanly. It's just for whatever reason, in that little window, he's exceptionally vulnerable. He's like the most vulnerable fighter I think I've ever seen in the first 3 or 4 minutes of a fight who's competing at this level. Like, and the contrast is so strong. Like, remember like Tim Gorman touched him up repeatedly with jabs?
Yeah, Tim Gorman like bloodied his face up in the first round before losing the rest of the fight in dominant fashion, which is, again, classic Almeida.
Yeah, and if you look at the numbers from that, Gorman landed like 20% of his strikes in the second and the third round. Yeah. Like, Almeida was, by those metrics, in those 2 rounds, an exceptional defensive fighter. And that's kind of the story of his career, is like, I don't know what the solution is to that, but it remains a fact.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, do you think maybe like Donald Cerrone, he is a slow starter sort of mentally, where it takes him a little while to warm up and get that feel? Or because for a while we've just been kind of falling back on the conclusion that it's just a facet of his style, which I do still think in some ways it is, that preferring that kind of range and so on and so forth. But we kind of thought the cure would be taking a little more time to adjust, not going out and swarming from the start. And he has done that and still been relatively hittable in the early going.
I think he's almost just better off going balls to the wall from the opening bell.
Maybe just overwhelming him.
Yeah, I mean, because at least then he's not giving his opponent time to find the range and find the timing.
He needs to hire Donald Cerrone as a consultant, somebody who's been through that experience, who can tell him what the cure is. As far as I know, Cerrone's people had him sparring backstage before a lot of his fights to warm him up before the fight happened. They had him doing like moderate sparring. So maybe,
yeah, I mean, maybe don't go talk to Donald Cerrone, because Cerrone won't want to talk about it. He does not like talking about fighting.
We'll talk to Gibson about it.
Yeah, I was going to say go talk to Brandon Gibson.
Yeah, only
which
talk
I think
to
is
Cerrone.
Just a good thing to recommend to people in general, because he's a very sharp guy. But maybe especially for Almeida.
Yeah, only talk to Cerrone about things like beer that comes with lime in it and fan boating and whatever other things Donald Cerrone
he's
certainly
got strong
enjoys.
opinions on labor unions. That's the thing you can talk to Donald Cerrone about.
Okay, all right.
Yeah,
now I know.
Donald Cerrone is a big fan of labor unions, and also a big fan of marijuana.
Really?
And does not know what flourless cake is. Other thing, so I was at this media day a few weeks ago. And Cerrone comes in, and the waitress comes around. And she's like, "Oh, would you like some dessert?" And he's like, "Well, what are my choices?" He's like, fruit with some berries with cream, or flourless chocolate cake." He turns to her and he says, totally incredulous, "What the fuck is flourless chocolate cake?" Flourless was genuinely puzzled by the concept of flourless chocolate cake.
Oh, I want to have Donald Cerrone at a cocktail party, and I want him to bring his own 12-pack of beer.
12-pack. Cerrone's going to bring more beer than that, right? Like,
he's going to bring some 30 cases of Milwaukee's Best. Yeah.
Budweiser, right. The man is sponsored.
Well, yeah. Maybe if it's a small enough function, he won't feel compelled. But I get the feeling he genuinely enjoys it.
Yeah, this is a man who is after his thing. But okay, real quick before we switch to Brunson Whittaker.
Yeah.
Kamaru Usman. What did you think?
I have been a big stalwart fan of Kamaru Usman's for some time. I think he's really solid. I think he is exactly the kind of fighter who really benefits from the training of Henry Hooft, who I think is maybe second only to Rafael Cordeiro when it comes to turning wrestle grapplers into competent strikers. And Usman, to me, reminds me of no fighter more than... he's like a blend of Dennis Bermudez and Frankie Edgar. You know what I mean? He has like Dennis Bermudez's explosiveness and athleticism, but kind of the process-driven intelligence of Frankie Edgar. I've been more impressed than anything else by Usman's ability to blend striking and grappling really seamlessly together, to use his takedowns to set up short shots, to hit people when they're worried about his takedowns, and to just basically do that at will, to play with that switch-up game in the way that still, even in this modern era of MMA, a lot of fighters struggle to do. And certainly his opponents struggle to keep up with it. So I have high hopes for Usman going forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think he is the best of a crop of welterweight prospects, most of whom have not really panned out over the last few years. Like I thought, Warley Alves was supposed to be the guy,
yeah,
and he has not really panned out.
He's Eric Silva 2.0.
Yeah, I mean, with all the good and bad that implies.
Yeah, right. Like he's a better version of Eric Silva, but he still has all the problems of Eric Silva.
I don't know what it is about X Gym and guys gassing. Like, do they just not do enough do they just not do enough cardio? Like, I don't understand how those guys can be so bad when you get into the second and third rounds. But
I think they just only throw power. Like I bet you they just do like short rounds of really hard sparring.
Yeah, that's entirely that's entirely possible. But Usman, he looks like a Henry Hooft trained striker in the way that he puts combinations together, in the way that he stays in the pocket to counter, in the way that he works all three levels in combination with each other, in his aggression and pressure and footwork. He is. I think Usman is like the type specimen for what the Black Zillions are trying to do in terms of putting all those skills together, because he's been there pretty much since day one of his career. Like, he showed up there, and his striking coach for his whole career has been Henry Hooft. He has been working with all of those guys in that room on his wrestling. He's already a great wrestler, but like his top game looks the way I think that like Neil Melanson wants a top game to look. You know, like
sure.
he is He is what they are trying to do, and it turns out what they're trying to do is pretty fucking good when all those pieces are working right together. But I mean, he has freakish Martian android strength. That's the way that Mike Reardon described him years ago when Zane and Tom scouted him for their scouting report, and they asked Mike to weigh in on his wrestling, and he's like, Usman can do things with like high crotch lifts that should be physically impossible, but that's how strong he is. Mm-hmm. So you take those kinds of physical gifts and combine them with those skills, and like I think he's a top 5 fighter.
Sure, he's on his way there. I mean, and also you have to talk about, like, Warlley Alves is also an insane athlete. That much is obviously true, and that is why people, including myself, had really high expectations for him coming off of tough Brazil. But Usman has a temper for that athleticism. I think Usman is a similar level of athlete, possibly more physically strong with his wrestling background, but is not going to go out there and just burn all of his energy away. You know, almost every fight he has, Kamaru Usman finishes stronger than his opponent. And I think that's something that cannot be overlooked. That is like a strategic way of approaching fights, that he does not burn out his energy. He fights intelligently. He builds his win from the beginning, from the ground up. And all they need to do now is just convince Henry Hoof to take a step out of the corner, and the team will be perfect. So, because I can't tell you, Pat, how many times I have heard the words "don't give up" while studying tape over the past few months. Maybe it's frequency bias, and it just seems like it's appearing more. But now that I know to listen for it, he tells his fighters that in almost every fight that is not going their way. And he told it to Michael Johnson against Khabib Nurmagomedov.
I do not think that is great cornering, but the man knows. Maybe he knows something that we don't on that front. I think he knows a lot that we don't.
His technical coaching is absolutely fantastic, and yes, it is certainly possible that us sitting here, we just don't know what the hell we're talking about when it comes to cornering fighters. Either way, I mean, he and the team have done a really remarkable job with Usman, and I agree. I think he has a lot of potential going forward, but. Enough about welterweights. Nobody cares about welterweights, Pat. We know what division they're here to hear us talk about. Obviously, it's the 185ers, the not quite big boys, the middleweights. And we have a fantastic middleweight main event taking place this coming weekend. That is between Robert Whittaker and Derek Brunson. And I like this fight for a lot of reasons. These are both guys who have impressed the hell out of me in their recent fights, who have comported themselves well against a relatively high level of opposition. They're both guys as well who are kind of part of the new crop at middleweight, future contenders rather than contenders at this very moment. And if one of them wins this fight impressively, very likely a near future contender. So what do you make of this matchup and the fighters taking part in it?
I'm a huge Robert Whittaker fan. I've been a Robert Whittaker fan for a long time, going back to when he was on Tough. Which seems like a really long time ago, and I guess it was like 4 years ago that he won Tough. But I always liked his athleticism. I always liked his ability to put blitzing combinations together. I always liked the pop that he had in his hands, his counterpunching ability. There was always just a lot to like for me about Whittaker, and I think at some point his lack of size as a middleweight is going to catch up to him. He's only 5'11", and I think that may even be a little bit generous. I don't know if it's this fight, though. I don't know if Brunson is going to be the guy who really exploits that. Primarily because I like Brunson a lot. I think Brunson's a really good fighter. I think he's one of the best clinch fighters in the division. I think maybe after Luke Rockhold, I think that Brunson is probably the best at that currently at 185. The problem for Brunson is getting there. It's covering that last little bit of distance because he likes to pressure. He likes to get after his opponents, but he doesn't have great pressure footwork. And so he really relies on lunging the last couple of feet to get in on a takedown attempt, to get to land his left hand or get into or walk his way into the clinch. And he's really vulnerable when he does that because his chin rises straight up in the air. His head comes way forward of his lead knee, and he just throws himself in. I think that's a really bad idea against a guy who has pretty good footwork like Whittaker does and who's a really good counterpuncher like Whittaker is. Like that's a very kind of a tactical kind of thing here, but it's just such a glaring thing that stands out to me. I don't know, Connor, what do you think?
Well, that's a point that I was certainly going to make, and I want to make another point that kind of builds on it, which is that lately Robert Whittaker has been doing the same thing And I wonder if maybe you have some insight on why that might be. Robert Whittaker used to do a lot of hanging back, a lot of keeping his opponents at bay. I wonder if the fact that he feels smaller at middleweight is the main thing that has changed that. But he's been a lot more aggressive since moving to 185. A lot more committed to sort of unpredictable forward-moving combinations, wide power punches. The Robert Whittaker that fought, say, Colton Smith and Court McGee, which is a fight that I thought he won at the time, is not the same Robert Whittaker who fought Uriah Hall and Brad Tavares and Rafael Natal. The approach is obviously very different. I think he's become a lot more aggressive, and while it's very impressive that he's still able to knock out and hurt middleweights in most of his fights, despite being pretty small for the division, I wonder if, as for, Brunson is going to be vulnerable coming forward to counterpunches, is Whittaker going to make himself vulnerable coming forward to takedowns? And which of those is going to become a bigger problem first, or will continue to be a bigger problem over the course of the fight?
See, I don't think it's going to be an issue for. I don't think that's going to be that walking his way into takedowns is going to be an issue for Whittaker. A, because he has really exceptional takedown defense. He has some of the best takedown defense in the division, and Brunson is not like he's super explosive takedown artist. That's not really Brunson. Brunson's game is not like shoot a double on you in open space, take you off your feet and slam you in the middle of the cage. He really relies very heavily on the fence, very heavily. But also I would note that what you're talking about in terms of Whittaker's stylistic evolution, in his last few fights, he has been fighting guys who were not coming after him. Natal is not really a pressure fighter. Hall is very much an outfighter. Tavares, that fight only lasted 44 seconds. Clint Hester was the last guy to really try and come after Whittaker, and Whittaker played like a very sharp outfighting game and landed a whole bunch of hard counters early in that fight. That's the last time we've seen him fight an opponent who was really aggressive and really tried to get after him. It didn't last very long for Hester. Like, Hester tried that in the opening minute and ate a bunch of big counters and then kind of let Whittaker pressure him. So maybe. So I don't know. I think that kind of stick and move game is all about disincentivizing. Sure. I don't think Brunson will be as easily put off it as Hester was.
Well, who comes after who? That's what I wonder. Because obviously I think Robert Whittaker's most impressive performances are the one where he picks his opponent apart, at least to a degree. He's still been like the Uriah Hall fight was very impressive, but there were a lot of near misses for Hall. That was a very nerve-wracking fight for me. And similarly, Derek Brunson, I think probably his most impressive performance, even though it wasn't a win, was the fight with Yoel Romero, where I think he kind of took 2 rounds off of Romero, or at least one convincingly, before sort of fading down the stretch. But that was a fight in which Romero was coming after him and he was fighting from the outside. Lately, neither Brunson nor Whittaker have really had the opportunity to fight that way. But I think both guys are less vulnerable, at the very least, when they're fighting off the back foot, when they're sticking and moving and pot-shotting from the outside, because they can rely on their opponents closing the distance so they don't have to overextend themselves to do it. Derek Brunson has been going absolutely crazy rushing after his opponents. I have to wonder if that is because he's seen that as being the best approach for these opponents, or is it like a Dong Hyun Kim thing where he's just going to do that from now on, where he just feels like he can run everybody over. And if it is the latter, then I think that will be a very difficult thing for him to make work against Whittaker. If it is not, and if he can come out here and fight intelligently against Whittaker, then I think he has a really strong chance of making Whittaker lunge after him and catching him off guard.
Well, I think that it is an intelligent approach for Brunson. Like, I think that it plays to his strengths, which are being really freakishly strong. I think he's an absurdly strong guy. Yeah. One of the strongest guys in the division. He's very explosive. So for him, that whole lunging the last few feet to make up for, again, like the lack of really, really sharp footwork, that works really well for him. He's a tremendously powerful puncher. I think we've seen that kind of beyond a doubt. So I think all of that in the context of his game and the skills that he has, which is really, really excellent work in the clinch, great chains of takedowns. I don't think he's really great at finding entries. I think he's discovered that
he's better with reactive.
What?
He's better with reactive shots. That's the thing. Some of his best takedowns off of single takedowns were in that Romero fight, setting them up from range.
But
He just hasn't done that style of fighting in 5 fights now.
I don't I think that was, I tend to think that was an outlier. And because I don't ever recall, aside from that fight, his reactive takedowns being so sharp.
When else has he been fighting that kind of opponent, though? The Brian Houston fight, he knocked the dude out instantaneously. And every other fight now for the past 5, and this is why I'm worried that it may be a permanent change, he's basically been coming after his opponents from the opening bell. They haven't come after him.
I don't know. I kind of wonder, because Brunson, like Whittaker, Brunson has been fighting guys who were not trying to come after him quite the same way. Like Lorenz Larkin was an outfighter.
I think, absolutely. But both of these guys, Lorenz Larkin was an outfighter, and Brunson kind of moved with him a bit, but he couldn't get him walking into a takedown. And then the next 4 guys he just blew out of the water in the first about 2 minutes of the fight each time. And then for Whittaker, his performances, both guys' performances have been really impressive. But I think it's a hard fight for me to call, because I haven't really seen something from both guys that proves to me they can beat each other. I haven't seen Whittaker against... I've seen him stuff takedowns at welterweight. You mentioned that he has some of the best defense in the division, statistically, I believe you were saying, but he also hasn't really faced that many great wrestlers since coming to middleweight. The best wrestler he faced was probably Brad Tavares, who got knocked out in 40 seconds, so he didn't get a chance to shoot. And then the second best wrestler is probably Rafael Natal, who's not a great wrestler. And so it's not since Colton Smith and Brad Scott have we really seen him against okay takedown artists, and I have to wonder how Whittaker, who is a small middleweight, deals with the strength and wrestling technique of Brunson. As for Brunson, how does he deal? I mean, we saw him knock out Uriah Hall, but again, it's Uriah Hall, and he wasn't as sharp in that fight as he was in the Whittaker fight. And so we haven't seen him have to deal with someone who is really going to try to pick him apart from range and throw power the way Whittaker will. Because even the version of Lorenz Larkin he fought, I don't think compares to the way Whittaker's performing now. So I just don't know. I think Whittaker's probably the most dangerous counterpuncher Brunson has faced, the one most likely to exploit the openings in his lunging style. But if the style of fighting is reversed, I think Derek Brunson is certainly the most likely to exploit Whittaker's power punching tactics, and to really teach him a lesson about what it means to grapple with a big middleweight. It's a tough one for me.
Yeah, I mean, I'm totally on board with that. Like, I could see it could, like, all of this discussion about, Whittaker landing counters from range and picking Brunson apart could look really silly if Brunson just walks through that, pins Whittaker against the fence, and blasts him in the clinch and with takedown chains.
If he gets another 2-minute knockout, it'll be the craziest shit I've ever seen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, like that, but that's like a real possibility here. I tend to be a believer in a guy's takedown defense until I see it proven wrong. Sure. Like, if I see a guy who has easily stuffed every takedown, who hasn't given up a takedown since 2013, despite having a fair few attempts thrown at him, and you can kind of evaluate the technical strength of his takedown defense. Whether it will be enough against a big guy, we're not really sure, but his technique is perfect. There's nothing wrong with the techniques he's showing. It's not like he's athleting his way out of these things the way that, remember before Eric Silva fought John Fitch back in 2012, and we were like, oh my God, look at how good Eric Silva's takedown defense is. Mm-hmm. In hindsight, that was all athleting. Whittaker's takedown defense, there's athleticism there, but it's athleticism in the service of really, really strong.
He's actually a solid grappler in every ground phase. He's
when he shoots takedowns, he has a lovely reactive double leg of his own.
Yeah, and he's impressive on the ground. He's got some good submission grappling and positional skills, as we saw against Uriah Hall, who is not a bad grappler off his back, as we saw against Mousasi. So he's pretty solid in that regard. But man, I everything has me worried now ever since Michael Johnson versus Khabib Nurmagomedov. Because while I did pick Khabib in that fight, I also expected Johnson to be more competitive in more than just 2 minutes. I didn't expect him to be really competitive in 2 minutes and then be completely dominated for the rest of the bout. And I know Derek Brunson is not Khabib Nurmagomedov, but in a lot of ways he's kind of similar. Vulnerable on the feet, but very powerful and pretty relentless when he gets his hands on you. And I don't know. I think I'm going to pick Derek Brunson. over Robert Whittaker, but I'm not really confident. I wouldn't be confident in either pick personally, and I've waffled several times.
Yeah, I'm going to go Whittaker just because I think like that lunging of Brunson stands out to me so clearly as being a real issue for him, and we know what a sharp counterpuncher Whittaker is.
Yeah.
And like, you know, I feel like this, like with Whittaker's takedown defense and his ability to break out of the clinch, like he's also very hard to hold in the clinch if he doesn't want to be there.
Yeah.
I'm kind of an innocent until proven guilty guy. Like if I see that you've done this successfully in the past, like I will believe that you can do it against a higher level of competition until I see that you can't, you know?
Sure.
So I guess on that basis, I'm going to pick Whittaker. But again, this is not like a real strong pick. And again, it would not at all surprise me if Brunson like just blew through that last little bit of range, pinned him against the fence, and blasted him. Utterly blasted him.
Nor would it surprise me if Whittaker just blew Brunson's head off in the first 30 seconds with a counter uppercut or something like that.
Wait, which would surprise you more?
Neither would that surprise me.
Neither would be surprising.
They're both likely, as is it likely that Whittaker like picks Brunson apart, or that Brunson holds Whittaker down for many rounds and one of the guys maybe gets a late stoppage. Who knows? It's a good fight. Looking forward to it. It is one of the few fights that I can proudly say to someone, look, middleweight puts out good fights and I don't have to be ironic about it. So
wait, it doesn't have to be like motivated reasoning.
Yeah, basically. It's just like, hey, look at these guys' past 3 fights, and most people would agree that yes, this is a good fight. So I'm happy about that. Good for my middleweights. Good for us fight fans. When we come back, we have one more fight that we do want to discuss somewhat in depth. We're going to talk about Sergey Kovalev versus Andre Ward for several relatively meaningless light heavyweight world titles, but also for all the marbles as far as bragging rights are concerned. We're going to talk about the controversy surrounding the result a little bit, and then also about the fight itself, which again was fantastic. So come back after this break for that. Financial support is fantastic, but there are other even easier ways to support Heavy Hands. Perhaps the best is by spreading the word. We know our fan base. You're all cool, popular people with serious social media presences. You're tastemakers and trendsetters. Okay, there are 1 or 2 of you that don't fit that description. You know who you are, but no matter what, you can always help us out by telling folks about the show. And you can also give us a positive rating and review on iTunes and Stitcher, things like that. We rely on word of mouth and positive feedback to grow and improve, so thank you very much for your time and your help. Now, back to the show. Welcome back to Heavy Hands. Final segment here. Sergey Kovalev versus Andre Ward. Pat, people are upset about this fight. And in my opinion, I'll just say this first off the bat. People are upset because the decision was controversial. A lot of people thought Sergey Kovalev deserved the win. Not everybody. A healthy minority thought that Andre Ward deserved the nod. And an even healthier portion of people don't really have that big a problem with it. But a lot of people, let's say about 50% of fans I've heard from, are really upset and think that Sergey Kovalev got robbed. And I'm going to just go ahead and say off the bat that I think this is why boxing fans, a group of which I consider myself one, can't have nice things. Because we so rarely get great fights in boxing anymore. I mean, that's why I'm a really big fan of boxing, but I watch a lot more MMA these days than I do boxing because there just aren't that many great fights between elite competitors. And just as I feel content skipping like every other fight night card for the UFC if I have to, I feel content skipping like 5 out of every 6 boxing events because they are as weak in comparison. It takes ages for the elite fighters to come together. And then when they do, because we're so unused to it happening now, I think, we finally see a really closely matched, hotly contested fight between 2 of the best in the world. And we can't help but think of it in terms of the robberies that we're used to seeing all the time. Or in terms of the one-sided beatings, the record padding that we're used to being fed as boxing entertainment. Personally, I thought this was an incredibly competitive and close fight. I would not have been upset if Sergey Kovalev had gotten the win. And I can't fathom anyone being 100% confident that one fighter deserved the nod here with so many swing rounds. But to me, the most important thing is that it was a really, really good fight.
Yeah, it was a really, really good fight. And it was a fight that was complex. There was a lot happening here. This was not really a banger. it had a lot of action, but it was not like this was not like Salido Vargas,
No.
But like for the thinking boxing fan, you're not going to get a whole lot of fights better than this, because it forced both guys to fight outside their comfort zone in ways that were really interesting. Like Connor, you noted on Twitter that Ward forced Kovalev to be a pot shotter.
Yeah.
Which is not something that Kovalev is bad at, but that is not where Kovalev is most comfortable. Kovalev is like a freight train. When he gathers momentum and he can move forward and really get into and really get after you, that's when he does his very, very best work, his most devastating work. And Ward never let him get uncorked like that. Conversely, Kovalev never let Ward really, really punish him with the jab. He never let Ward off the hook in terms of sticking and moving. His counters were always ready, and he never let Ward get really comfortable on the inside.
Yeah.
He managed to stymie the sneaky offense that Ward is really good at generating, and conversely, Ward managed to stymie Kovalev's best offense.
Yeah, let me ask you about the infighting, because again, a lot of boxing fans, you should see the YouTube comments on my video, by the way, my how Andre Ward beats Sergey Kovalev video. A lot of non-native English speakers, I think, are taking that to mean how Andre Ward beat Sergey Kovalev in the past tense, and are not even watching the video before commenting and shouting about what a robbery it was. To my credit, it got a hell of a lot of views after the fight because people were so worked up. But people are upset. People are mad at Andre Ward. A lot of conspiracy theories are flying around as a result. But I don't see how you can look at this fight and not be impressed with what Ward did, to recuperate from a knockdown early. But really, the point I want to make is one of the main arguments for the people who are mad at Andre Ward is that he did, of course, an excessive amount of clinching and holding in this fight, and they knew he was going to do it all along. And of course, Kovalev was worried about it. He told the referee to watch out for headbutting and elbowing and holding in the clinch. And everyone knew that Andre Ward is a holder and a dirty fighter, and yet he did it. He held Sergey Kovalev. Honestly, I think Sergey Kovalev initiated as many holds as Andre Ward. I think Andre Ward was more committed as the fight went on to getting inside, but I really think Sergey Kovalev was doing at least half of the actual holding, trying to hold the opponent's arms so that they could not work, trying to smother. And I think it was a smart move. And it's not a knock on Kovalev, but I think it's pretty crazy that people are looking at this fight and saying Andre Ward held Sergey Kovalev when that would make no sense for him to hold Sergey Kovalev, because clearly Andre Ward wanted to do work inside, not keep his opponent from doing work.
I think that's correct. I think that's a really perceptive thing. And I noticed that especially early, especially in the first few rounds, Kovalev was happy to initiate clinches on his terms.
Yeah.
Right? Like he was happy to tie up as long as it was on his terms. What changed over the course of the fight wasn't the number of times the guys got a hold of each other. It was under whose conditions that happened.
Right.
So when in the later rounds Ward was able to really get some work going on the inside, he landed a bunch of good sequences of body punches. Later in the fight, he landed some good shots on breaks. That was because it was him who was dictating the conditions under which they clinched. Like, so I did not think that Kovalev was going to be able to force Ward's head down the way that he was early, into like almost like this quasi front headlock type of thing.
Yep.
Like that Kovalev really likes to do. He does that against everybody. I did not think that he was going to be able to break Ward's posture that easily.
Although I was pleased to see how Andre Ward dealt with it compared to most of Kovalev's opponents. Bending his knees, sort of popping his hips back, and just rolling his head out of the position rather than just sort of losing his balance and falling forward. It was clear throughout the entirety of this fight that both of these guys were the best either of them had ever faced. They both had more answers to what the other guy wanted to do than either of them had ever seen.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, and I think that's what made this such a compelling fight in the ring, was both guys forced the other to do things that they had not previously been forced to do. Like, this is the thing about fights between really, really elite opponents in any combat sport, is that they're going to force you. Your plan A is not going to win the fight for you. If your plan A wins the fight for you, then your opponent is probably not as elite as he was cracked up to be,
Sure, yeah.
Like, so like I'll give you an MMA parallel for this. the rematch between Ioana Jędrzejczyk and Claudia Gadelha, a matchup of two really, really elite fighters. Jędrzejczyk's plan A of just separate, get back to range, and strike in the early rounds did not work for her. She had to work and work and work and work and work and wear Gadelha down to the point where she could do that in the last couple of rounds. She effectively had to plan B herself to win that
She
fight.
had to wear her down to the point where Jędrzejczyk could start pressuring her without getting taken down. Because she had to pressure to rack up enough points to get back into the fight.
Yeah, so that to me is an example of a fight between two elite competitors who turn out to be as elite as they're supposed to be. Like John Jones versus Daniel Cormier, by contrast, Jones had to adapt and had to do things, but he still basically won that fight with plan A, you know? So to me, when a fight turns out to be this close, it turns out to be everything it's supposed to be. It's because neither guy can go out there and do exactly what they wanted to do the whole fight. Sure. I think that to me is a really defining characteristic of a really closely matched fight, and I think that's what we saw.
Yeah, a fight that speaks volumes about the greatness of the two fighters. You know, I think both of these guys after this fight deserve to be numbers 2 and 3 pound for pound under maybe Roman Gonzalez, and some would put them above him. But that's the kind of fight I say it as, where both guys kind of go up in esteem to the top of the pile, with the winner maybe getting the higher spot, but there are a lot of people who thought that Sergey Kovalev deserved the nod here. I'm curious, Pat, how did you score this fight? Did you keep a scorecard?
I did, yeah. I had it 115-113 Kovalev.
Which I think is a very fair decision.
Let me go back and check let me go back to check just so I can be precise.
It might be 115-112, which would be 7 rounds to 5 for Kovalev.
I had it 114 113
for Kovalev.
Yeah.
So basically you had it a draw with the knockdown advantage.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. I had so what happened was I was watching through the first 11 rounds, and then we discovered that Lucy had eaten half of a hard rubber toy. So this was literally as the 12th round was starting. So I had to rush to the kitchen, get the hydrogen peroxide, shoot it into her mouth to get her to throw up, do literally half of a rubber toy that she'd eaten. So I did not I missed the controversy around the end of the fight. I went back, I watched the 12th round. I'm like, oh, I think that was a Ward round. I went to go type up my score, and then I looked at my timeline, and it was like everybody mad about the decision.
Yeah.
So I never actually posted what my final score was, but I had it 114-113. I was instead cleaning up vomit and dog
Jesus
vomit.
Christ.
That was how I ended my Saturday.
I had it. Well, this is a testament to how close the fight was and how subjective scoring is, how difficult it is to score a fight of this caliber. When you get a good fight, those are the ones that turn in the most controversial results, because they're hard to score. Like Dillashaw-Cruz, one of the best, most technical matchups we've ever seen in MMA. And there's a lot of controversy about it because it was so closely contested and such a great contest. I scored at 114-113 for Ward, but I gave the 12th round to Kovalev, which I think is an indication of how many swing rounds there are. You gave the fight to Kovalev, but gave Ward the 12th round. And I think there's a case to give either guy a lot of the rounds in this fight, with very few really clear rounds.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say. I would say that there were only maybe 2 clear rounds the whole fight, 2 or maybe 3 clear rounds. I
would say the first 2 for Kovalev, maybe the 9th round for Ward.
Yeah, I was going to say the 9th or the 10th for Ward.
Yeah, and basically everything else was really hotly contested with a lot of momentum swings. Kovalev doing I think kind of the feeling I ended up with going into this fight was that Andre Ward had to do Andre Ward things to win, and Sergey Kovalev would have to adapt. And that basically that would give Ward the advantage. Both guys had to adapt a lot, and Sergey Kovalev did it better than I would have given him credit for. The fact that Ward successfully kept him from setting his feet for those forward charges he likes to do, kept him from really letting his combinations go, and yet Kovalev was picking Ward off with his jab and catching him on the ear with right hands when he tried to work his way inside, and smothering him in the clinch, and even in the 12th round doing some good punching in the clinch as well. I mean, it was just amazing to me to see two guys really bring out new levels that we've never seen Andre Ward have to put up with that kind of adversity. And it was really impressive to see him. The fact that I think some of his... He got knocked down in the second round, just made it out of the round, and then came back, and I thought he won the third. And even if a lot of people gave Kovalev the third, they could see that Ward was putting on a really impressive performance. came back and really got himself back into the fight immediately after being knocked down.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I think the third round, I had it for Kovalev, but I think that's when the momentum started to swing and Ward managed to get himself back into the fight and started to figure things out. Because I think I scored the fourth for Ward.
Yep.
But I think my exact comment was third round still Kovalev's, but Ward's figuring things out.
Right.
And like it's a testament to how great a fighter Andre Ward is that even despite getting knocked down and despite getting buzzed by big punches, he ate he didn't eat like in absolute terms a lot, but any number of punches to eat from Sergey Kovalev, clean power punches, is too many. And he ate a bunch, and he managed to get it, and he still managed to figure out what was happening. He managed to keep his head. I think this fight to me, because again, I did score for Kovalev. I thought this was a testament to what great work John David Jackson has done with Kovalev over the years in turning him into a crisp enough boxer to pot shot with Andre Ward and win a lot of those rounds.
A lot of people are saying that like John David Jackson dropped the ball, that he's clearly not as good a trainer as Virgil Hunter. And I think
the exact opposite, man.
I don't see a case. I think Virgil Hunter's a great trainer, specifically for Andre Ward. I think he is Andre Ward's Matt Hume. I think they are a perfect match. But John David Jackson, I think, has done a remarkable job with Kovalev. And I have heard from other trainers, I think Abel Sanchez once worked with Kovalev, and he basically concluded that he was untrainable. Kovalev is I think, a pretty hard-headed guy. He has his style of fighting. I don't think he's an easy guy to work with necessarily for a trainer. And you can see in a lot of fights, the brawler comes back out in him when things aren't going his way. We've seen that a lot. We saw it in the first Pascal fight. And crazily, John David Jackson had Kovalev so well prepared for this fight that I think he was more frustrated by Isaac Chilemba, who is not on Andre Ward's level. You know what I mean? Like he had that fight. It gave me a basis to pick Andre Ward, and it gave them a basis to think that Andre Ward had posed a problem as well. Like Kovalev and Jackson learned from the Chilemba fight how to arguably beat Andre Ward. And I think that says a lot about how well they prepare.
Yeah, absolutely. I think to me, a lot of the Chilemba fight comes down to Kovalev maybe not taking him as seriously. And I think there were reports that Kovalev wasn't training that hard for that fight. But I mean, I think like this was a masterpiece of preparation. It was a masterpiece of game planning. It was a masterpiece of execution from Kovalev. Like, because I stick by what I said beforehand. I think that a thinking fighter like Andre Ward is always going to be tough for somebody who can be baited into brawling the way that Kovalev can. There is always going to be a chance in a Kovalev fight that he loses his head. And that's a really, really hard thing against a fighter like Andre Ward, who really lives for that. Like he lives to exploit any sort of moment of mental weakness. And Ward, despite doing everything he could to pull Kovalev out of his game, despite all the stuff he tried inside, despite all of the body work, he was never able to force Kovalev into an Andre Ward fight. You know?
Yeah, absolutely. It was even going almost the entire way, and that's pretty remarkable. Before we wrap up very quickly, what do you think about a rematch? Sergey Kovalev and Kathy Duva, his manager, I believe, have a promoter, I guess, have a contract a clause in the contract for an immediate rematch in case of a loss for Kovalev. And so we don't know how long it'll take to happen, but should they choose to go forward with it, we may be seeing this fight again next year. And so a lot of people have been saying that Andre Ward had trouble here, but he will do better in the second fight because he's that kind of fighter. He learns from his opponents. But I think Sergey Kovalev and his team have easily proven that they are also not as one note as many expected them to be. A lot of people, I think the majority of people picked Andre Ward in this fight. And that even says, again, how surprisingly convincing his performance was, because most people now are arguing that he deserved the win. So what do you think would happen in the second fight between these guys? What adjustments, in brief, would you like to see?
Adjustments. I think I would like to see Ward working the body a bit more early. Yeah. Like it took him a couple of rounds to really get into that. I think because he was just so shook by Kovalev's power, which is just shocking. I would like to see Ward try to dig into that earlier. I would also like to see Ward up the volume earlier. I know he likes to take a little while to get into his rhythm, but I would like to see him push a bit more of a pace if he can. I know that Kovalev's power is going to be a reason to maybe not do that, but still, I think it would behoove Ward to try and push it a bit more. For Kovalev, I think he did exactly what he had to do. But I think he almost fought too smart at times. There were times when he could have pushed a little bit more and he backed off. I think because he was worried again about getting drawn into Ward's kind of fight. I think if he could be a bit more judicious about saying, okay, like I have this guy in a little bit of trouble. If I land a couple of shots here, I can really, really sway the judges in this round. Because that happened a number of times. There were rounds that ended up going to Ward where Kovalev landed some good shots and backed off a little bit to avoid giving Ward opportunities to do his thing.
Yeah.
Like that, I think that happened. That happened in the 10th round, right? Like Kovalev landed a really, really good, clean right hand.
He landed a huge right hand in the 10th round. Yeah, one that looked as hard as the one that dropped Ward in the second.
And he ended up kind of backing off it.
Yeah.
And I think that Ward ended up taking that round on the scorecards. Where if he had just pushed a little bit more, if he'd let himself be Sergey Kovalev a little bit more, maybe he wins that round. Maybe he wins the fight. You know. So I would like to see maybe a bit more judicious aggression from Kovalev the second time around, while still maintaining his control, while still keeping himself out of Andre Ward's kind of fight, maybe just picking and choosing a few more shots here and there.
Sure, yeah. I would like to see more body work from Kovalev. I think that would be a really important adjustment for him. I don't think he has a bad gas tank. He's typically very strong at keeping up a good pace as the fight goes on, but he definitely slowed down at the end of this fight because Ward was chipping away at him so much. And I think it would have made a lot of sense, especially with an opponent with such a great ability to defend his head as Andre Ward, to go for that body early and often. I would like to see that from just to keep the fight even, as it went down, because Andre Ward's going to come in and work the body. And I do think Andre Ward maybe has a little more power than I gave him credit for. He hits surprisingly hard, and I don't think he's much of a finisher really, but he has hurt some people with things that kind of look like arm punches, because I think he just keeps himself in a good rooted position when he throws. So you need to compete with that. You can't just expect to brush off all of those uppercuts and hooks and jabs to the body. And then I would like to see Kovalev cutting off the ring a little better. I know it's not a thing that he really does that well. It's not like a specialization of his, but he did it a lot more effectively against Bernard Hopkins. And I think probably because Bernard Hopkins was not as aggressive, was a lot more laid back, and was just circling the ropes. But he ended up following Andre around a lot, and it would have probably helped him a little more if he was cutting off the ring throughout the fight, at least throughout the first half of the fight. He could have cinched it rather than starting to kind of lose momentum around the 5th and 6th rounds. And as for Ward, I don't know, man, about coming after Kovalev early. Harold Letterman said that shit on the HBO broadcast. He was like, I wish I could do Harold Letterman's voice. I was about to try, but he said,
okay, Jim.
Okay, Jim. He said, I would just go after him. He was like, I would just go after Kovalev. And Max Kellerman very rightly was like, yeah, easier said than done, Harold. Like, I think that's what Ward wanted to do. I think he wanted to take one feel him out round and then show Kovalev he was there and that he meant business. And the first time he tried to let his right hand go, he got knocked down. So I really think it's a uniquely dangerous opponent for Andre Ward in terms of how much power Kovalev packs, but also how much precision. He is a lot like the Conor McGregor of boxing in how he throws these long, straight shots very accurately, and they just have this stunning power to them that other people's punches don't have. And I don't know, man. I mean, that convinced Ward to let go of the idea of throwing the right hand for like the next 4 rounds because he knew it got him countered, and he went solely to his favored left hook and his good jab and moving around a lot. So I can see the sense in it, but he's not, who was the last guy that Andre Ward fought? Sullivan Barrera. You know what I mean? He's not like an unpolished puncher. He is truly a boxer puncher, and one that is becoming more disciplined. So I kind of think I would want to see Andre Ward do a lot of pot-shotting early in the fight. A lot of pot-shotting, body jabs mostly. Keep Kovalev from setting his feet, set that tone early, start sapping his energy early, but do not start to step in really until he's already started to slow down a bit. But that's the thing. It is such a knife's edge for both of these guys to walk to clearly beat the other. I don't know that, Kovalev, of course, has the stronger chance being the knockout puncher, but I don't know that either of them ever will. They could fight a dozen times, and I don't think either guy, 10 out of those 12 times, would convincingly beat the other. Yeah,
I mean, I really think, like, what this fight showed me was that doing what Ward did is not going to tire Kovalev out enough, So, like, I really think Ward needs to take a couple more chances and run a little more risk, especially now that he has a better sense for how hard Kovalev hits.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that what stunned Ward was not Kovalev's power. It was not just Kovalev's power. It was how much harder Kovalev hit than he thought he was going to.
Sure. Yeah.
Like,
it's a realization.
It really is a realization. And, like, I think if you let one punch put you off your game plan the way that Ward did for a couple of rounds, I think the fight was as close as it was because Ward let himself get put off his game plan. So you could see that in his corner.
You think Ward should Marvin Hagler him? Should do what Marvin Hagler did to Tommy Hearns? Basically, like just get in his face and
not at that pace.
Well,
not at that pace.
Will there ever be a fight fought at that pace ever again? Who knows?
Yeah. I mean, but no. I mean, I think he does need to, instead of throwing. I think that Ward was throwing like 12 punches around.
Yeah.
I think he needs to throw 18 punches around. Something. I think he needs more output. Like if you're gonna try and be the attrition fighter, you can't be an attrition fighter working at the pace that Ward was early. Like that's not gonna fly. But at any rate, before we wrap up, for those of our fans who may be thinking about looking at a little more boxing, got a pretty good fight this weekend, Connor.
Oh yeah, absolutely. We have Nicholas Walters versus Vasily Lomachenko, which is an amazing fight. Do you want to talk about it briefly before we go?
No, I mean maybe if we've got time next week, maybe recap it a little bit. We should
definitely recap it.
But I just want to throw that out there to our listeners. You gotta check this fight out. This is going to be fantastic.
If Kovalev-Ward convinced you that maybe you should watch a little more boxing between like elite contenders, fortunately, 2016 has not been entirely wasted. We have another fight that meets that description. Not like top 10 pound for pound guys, but one of them is, and the other guy is a very solid young fighter. So Walters versus Lomachenko. Lomachenko, I think, should be favored in that fight, and I think he's my pick. But Nicholas Walters has surprised me before. He's kind of a wild man, and he walks to the ring with a gigantic wooden axe. So he's not a man to be overlooked. So that one should be a great fight. So we will hopefully get more of a chance to talk about that one next week.
Yeah, I sincerely hope so. I just remember watching Walters knock the fuck out of Nonito Donaire and Victor Chinian and thinking, like, this guy is a talent. Like, holy crap, he's a talented fighter. Like you, I think Lomachenko wins, but it's a really, really good matchup. And Walters is an opponent who can test Lomachenko in some ways he hasn't been tested recently.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, a guy kind of like Kovalev in some ways, not similar stylistically, but like Kovalev, a heavy puncher. Nicholas Walters is a heavy puncher with a surprising amount of craft, a surprising ability to adapt to difficult circumstances. So, yeah, it should be a fun fight. But that about does it for us. Pat, before we go, what do you have coming out this week?
Not very much, frankly. I have a preview of this weekend's UFC card coming out on Thursday. I will have a new episode of The Fall of Rome up the day that this episode comes up, coming out on Wednesday. But that's about it. It's a pretty light week for me. What are you doing, Connor?
Same here. I am doing my Sherdog preview for Whittaker versus Brunson. And then an Andre Ward, Sergey Kovalev breakdown video that may not come out till early next week, trying to get away from those copyright strikes. It is fair use, HBO. It is fair use, but I want to analyze that one, maybe try to soothe the wound that Kovalev's loss has caused in a large portion of the boxing community by explaining why the fight was just so goddamn good. I'm not going to really try and make a strong case for why Andre Ward won, but there are so many wrinkles to that fight that deserve looking into, and it's an opportunity to me watch that fight like a half dozen more times, which I'm absolutely happy to do. So that'll be coming out very soon as well. Otherwise, I think that's about it. And that is about it for our show. So thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Find us on social media. Pat over here is at Patrick_Wyman, W-Y-M-A-N. And I'm at Boxing Bush, B-U-S-C-H. That's how you spell that one. And otherwise, you can find the podcasts and our work on Bleacher Report, Bloody Elbow, Sherdog, various places. Check out my YouTube channel. More boxing videos will be going up on there going forward. So that's just Connor Ruebusch, the channel on YouTube. And thank you again for joining us today. If you came here for the finer points of face punching, you came to the right place. This has been Heavy Hands.